Hi guys, Darren at Protopilot here, and in this video I'm going to take you through a talk I did recently at UX Camp Brighton. And the main focus of this talk is to explain to you, I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted here, but for those of you out there they're not too sure how prototyping fits into the design process, this talk is going to take you through a number of ways I think you can use prototyping within your design workflow. Okay, so this talk is called How Prototyping Can Help You Design Better. And without further ado, let's jump into it. Okay, so before we get started, I think it's important to define what we think prototyping is. So this is a quote from the Interaction Design Foundation. And it states that prototyping is an experimental process where design teams implement ideas into tangible forms from paper to digital. So that's kind of how they explain prototyping. And it's quite common for us to think about prototyping in the early stages of the design process. We may be putting some wireframes together. We may be putting a click-through prototype together. And it's got a number of benefits, right? It's going to communicate our designs more completely. It's going to cut down on wasted time in development, so the other end of the design process. And it's going to create better product experiences. Okay, we talk about products being delightful and lovely and easy to use. You know, if you're prototyping, you're really building a version of the final product. And for that reason, you're accounting for all the things that you probably don't really account for when you're designing in tools like Figma or Adobe XD. So this is kind of what prototyping is and kind of where the benefits are. Okay, so I was watching a talk by Tom Chi on YouTube a few weeks ago, and Tom Chi was a designer on the Google Glass project. And within this talk, he was talking about the rules of prototyping. So I kind of like these two rules he kind of mentioned. So number one, take the quickest path to a direct experience. So when we think about prototyping, we're really thinking about trying to get to a version of our design which is as realistic as possible. So if we're designing a mobile app, then we really want to get a direct experience of that mobile app, which means we want our prototype to be on a mobile app, on a mobile phone, and we can play with it on our phone, and we can really kind of have a direct experience of that idea. So this is much better than just looking at some frames inside of Figma. When you're doing that, when you're looking at a design on your computer, you're not interacting with it at all. It's a very passive experience, and because of that, you're not going to really think of all of the things that you should be thinking of, or you might think of when you're actually using it. Because when you're using something, you're involving muscle memory, you're involving ergonomics. So there's a whole bunch of things that you're involving when you're using your prototype, as opposed to just looking at it. And the second point that he makes is doing is the best kind of thinking. And what he really means by that is that when you're making something, you're going to be engaging with it a lot more. You're going to come up with more ideas than you are if you're just designing it within Figma or Adobe XD or Sketch. So that's a really important method for designing. You're going to come up with a lot more ideas. Okay, so there's a number of forms of prototyping. So a lot of these you should hopefully be familiar with. One of the kind of, I guess, legacy ones now, I kind of think of it as a legacy one, is paper prototyping. Still used, and it's a really great way of learning how to prototype or starting to think how to prototype, because when you're drawing on paper and you're making things out of paper, so in a very non-digital format, you're really taking away all of the digital tools and all of the friction that comes with them, okay? So that's a really good exercise to do. It's not very time efficient when you're working commercially, but if you think about it, when you're actually sketching ideas, you're kind of starting that process. You're kind of starting the process of thinking about your design in terms of multiple screens. You're drawing buttons, you're thinking about the interactions between those screens. And of course, yes, you could make a paper prototype at that stage. The one I kind of use more often in replacement of the paper prototype is what I call a low fidelity prototype. and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by this kind of split analogy here, low, low. You can see I've got low, mid, and high, high. So in this particular version, I'm still making a digital prototype, but I'm using my sketches to kind of stitch it together. This low fidelity prototype is what you would know as a click-through prototype. And the split of low means that the first low is referring to the visual UI fidelity. So that's the drawing. So it is low because I'm just using a sketch. And then the second low is referring to the interaction and motion design. So I really do think about those two things separately, and I suggest that you do as well. And here we're using a low fidelity interaction model because we're just using that click-through prototype. It's just kind of using there's no animation at all really. We're just kind of having like jump cuts between each screen that I've drawn, just to kind of start to get a kind of almost storyboard kind of animatic feel. And if you don't know the word animatic, that's used a lot in the animation industry. When they're starting to think about animations, they put an animatic together, which is a very basic version of the final thing. Their kind of version of a low fidelity prototype, I guess. So that's that one. Next up, we've got low stroke mid fidelity. So we can be using our sketches, we can be using wireframes. So we still want to keep the visual UI fidelity quite low because, as you're probably well aware, the higher fidelity your UI and the more work you put into it, the more kind of wedded you're going to become to that idea, you're kind of more biased you're going to become. And also it takes a lot longer to create those things. So we want to be in this stage where we're kind of trying out lots of ideas, throwing things away. The mid fidelity here is, and I'm using Protopie here, is I'm starting to use some features that Protopie gives me, for example, like access to the camera on my device. So that's a really quick, easy thing to do in Protopie. Obviously, it really makes you start to feel that this app is a real working app. It's using a real camera. You can see your face through that camera, and you can start to get more of a sense of kind of where the design is and whether it's kind of on point. You've kind of accounted for everything. And this is a good stage to kind of try out lots of ideas as well. And then finally, we've got high fidelity. And high fidelity is a prototype. You're still prototyping. I guess there's two kind of parts I think of when I think about high fidelity prototyping. One is that I'm thinking about testing that high fidelity prototype with potential customers, with people that are going to be using the final app experience. And the whole point is to make them think it's a real app without it being the real app. So we're still in that stage where we can throw ideas away. We haven't committed to build, to engineering, to development, but we're certainly giving the impression, the experience that it's a real thing. And you can get very high fidelity with Protopie and other tools out there as well. And then I'm also, the second part of high is I'm starting to involve all of the motion design, so the final motion design as well. And the second part of using a high fidelity prototype is for handoff to developers and engineers. Okay, so I'm now considering all of the motion design, specifically exactly how I want it to work in the app, and I can hand over this, and we'll look at how we can do this a little bit further into the talk. But I'm starting to explicitly show the engineering team exactly how I want my design to work. So that's kind of high. And of course, with all of these, you can kind of mix them up. So I've just kind of put down 3 here, but you could certainly go low, high, you could go mid, so, you know, really whatever makes sense for your approach. Just remember that you're always trying to get to that direct experience, as Tom said, as quickly as possible. So whatever gets you to understanding what the real problems are and solving those problems as quickly as possible is kind of what your aim should be, okay?